right. Okay, thank you. Just to follow up then, over the break, did you have the opportunity to follow up any of the questions I put to you on notice before the break?
No, Senator. We've taken those questions on notice. We'll provide an answer when we've got one.
Okay. I suspect that some of the questions that I want to put to you about the situation in Yemen is likely can be much more relevant to your DFAT colleagues a little bit later in the week. Yep. But I guess I'm trying to understand the overlap, given that you folks are engaged jointly with DFAT in assessing the risks of particular defence export to a particular part of the world, which means you must have some visibility when you're making that assessment about, you know, I think you quoted before, wrong hands, wrong kind of equipment, wrong part of the world. So are you aware that millions of people in Yemen are at risk of effectively a military-enforced famine through bombing of essential infrastructure, ports, power stations, food installations, that kind of stuff? Are you aware of the scale of the conflict in Yemen?
Senator, in broad terms, but as you point out, Australia's foreign policy positions in relation to Yemen are a matter for the Foreign Affairs portfolio to discuss.
I'm happy if you want to keep your answers within the range circumscribed by the kind of assessments that you would need to make. And is this somebody within your department making these assessments, or is it you personally as to whether a particular transaction should occur or not?
Senator, as I said, there's 4,000 or so exports every year. I have an organisation within Miss Lewis's division who has the key responsibilities for working across government and where practical within the defence portfolio, in other parts of the defence portfolio, to coordinate the information that's required to make the judgment.
Okay, great. So according to your judgment, are there war crimes and large-scale human rights abuses occurring in Yemen?
Senator, I don't think that's really a question that I can answer. I'm not a Yemen expert.
You've just said that you've been engaged in assessing exactly the questions that I'm putting to you. How do you not know?
On the basis of those exports, Senator, we did not consider the exports would contribute to the factors that I've outlined around regional instability, human rights, and national security, foreign policy and international obligations. So if you just gets back to the export, you get an export application and you assess that on a case-by-case basis on its merits with due consideration of the things that you know. And in relation to those exports that we've been discussing, the thresholds were met for allowing the export.
I would love to see the criteria that allow you to decide that arms exports to one of the worst human rights abusers on the planet, engaged in a horrific military campaign in Yemen, passes some kind of threshold test. Could you table for us the criteria that you assess against those categories that you put to us before: human rights, regional stability, and so on?
Senator, it's around the actual export. So I have been through those 5 criteria. I can put a bit more information around that in writing if you wish.
Well, somewhere, I'm presuming that your assessors aren't just spitballing in front of a whiteboard. There must be written criteria against which you assess.
Yes, there are written criteria.
Could you table those criteria for us, please?
No, we will not I can give you some general terms, but we do not table make public the specific criteria.
How come?
Because it goes to needing to ensure that our export control system is not able to be played and gamed either, Senator. So we have criteria. They're outlined in broad terms, as I've said there, but I'm happy to go into a little bit more information, which I've done with Senator Moore, but I would not articulate it in a fine-grained sort of regulatory type of language.
I gather that you're a bit unhappy, but unhappiness isn't a public interest immunity ground. Can you please be very clear why you're not able to table that material? Go ahead, Minister, if you have anything you want to add.
Skinner has indicated, I have indicated that a number of factors are taken into account. We've been through the assessment criteria, which include international obligations, human rights, regional security, national security and foreign policy. The requirements of the Arms Trade Treaty we've discussed. The Defence Trade Controls Act we've discussed. In relation to the export approvals that are specifically of concern, it would seem to you, we've indicated that those details are not provided due to commercial in confidence considerations, that the process that Defence uses as a regulator relies on a very frank and open exchange of information with applicants, which includes applicants sharing their sensitive commercial implication. When applicants make an approach for a permit, we undertake to use that applicant's information for those assessment and compliance activities. And releasing that information, it is considered view would breach that confidence and would undermine any trust in our ability to protect applicants' professional and commercial information, which would in fact also be detrimental to our ability to effectively regulate the export of military goods and technology. What our export controls recognise is our international obligations as a member of the arms control regimes, a signatory to the Arms Trade Treaty, and so on. Ms Skinner has indicated that we make those assessments against the 5 criteria, which she's outlined again to Senator Moore, to yourself, to Senator Gallagher. If there are any specific questions you wish to place on notice, then perhaps you can do that. But in context of your other questions, they seem, it would seem to me, they are more for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I
will take it up with our DFAT colleagues a bit later in the week. But you've given us, I'm sure you're internally very confident from the outside and not having access to the kind of information that you have with you at the table. I don't understand what kind of criteria you could bring to bear that would sanction military exports to a country like Saudi Arabia, where there are unquestionably violations of international law occurring in Yemen. Is it simply a case of making sure that none of that equipment travels into Yemen? Or like, how is this done? How is this justified?
Senator, as I've said, it depends on the equipment. And if we have no concern that the equipment is going to end up in a situation where there would likely cause human rights concerns, then the permit is issued. Saudi Arabia, Australia has a relationship with Saudi Arabia, and we do have trade with Saudi Arabia, as we do other countries and other Middle Eastern countries. So it is a perfectly proper that an Australian company is able to export goods if it satisfies the criteria that we have been discussing.
It's striking me as slightly ironic that one of the reasons that you can't be transparent with us here is that you need vendors to be transparent. Is that kind of the argument that you're running? You can't tell us these things because if you did, the vendors wouldn't be able to be open and transparent with you. Is that a reasonably accurate paraphrasing?
Senator, we ask the company to provide a great deal of detail about their company, their goods, where their goods are going, and we expect and enable that transparency in a commercial transaction, because that is actually what the company is actually doing in selling the goods, and we have a responsibility to protect their commercial interest.
What about the responsibility to protect civilians in Yemen?
And Senator, so we have that obligation. We have an obligation also to ensure that the goods do not contribute to activities that we would not want them to.
And how do you do that?
So we satisfy both those criteria and we issue the permit.
How do you do that? That second part.
How we do that?
I understand how you protect the commercial interests of the arms trade. I'm very clear on that. It's extremely disappointing, but at least you've provided some clarity. How do you provide for protection and confidence that Australian military exports won't be used to help extend and further human rights abuses inside Yemen?
Because where we have a concern that that will occur, we do not issue the permit.
How do you, once you are issuing permits, I think that's reasonably clear, how do you ensure after the fact, after the gear has left our shores, how do you ensure that that's not happening?
Well, we have other ways of monitoring where we can through intelligence and other things where we might understand where munitions are used. We don't track Australian goods and companies per se, but should there be at some other point a concern, then we would add that to our base of information, but we have no such concerns in relation to this equipment.
Mr Sargent, you look like you wanted to say something.
Look, these decisions are always made on a case-by-case basis. Defence provides input into the decision on the basis of policy and what Defence is able to contribute, including its knowledge of the company. What goes into the decision making is the nature of the product or the equipment, what it's likely to be used for, and the political and human rights and other policy contexts within which that country's operating in. And all those considerations go into a judgment about whether we would allow the export to occur. As part of that, you can only use certain things for certain things, so we have a sense of what the possibilities are in terms of how it might be used, and we would also talk to the country about what they would do. And so all those go into making a judgment, and sometimes we refuse the permit and other times we don't. So to me it's not a formulaic process, it's a process where there is a set of policy criteria set by government, there's a set of international treaty obligations which we must meet. They all go into the mix, and out of that a judgment is made about whether an export permit should be made or not.
I've just got a couple more and then I think I'm getting the one. Can I just put two on notice if that's okay, Chair, if you're about to wrap me up? Firstly, could you provide on notice any information as to whether you've ever denied a permit for an export to Saudi Arabia? And secondly, whether there are any thresholds as to how bad it would need to get in Yemen before you would reconsider exporting military equipment to Saudi Arabia?
I suggest that's a question for the Foreign Affairs and Trade Senator. But
with great respect, Minister, these are the folks signing the certificates that allow
We'll
these.
have a look at it, I said, Senator.
Well,
Thank you.